Hi all. So in this video we're going to discuss about the physiology of hypothalamus. So basically we'll be talking about the functional anatomy, the nucleus and the functions because all the three have been asked repeatedly in many university questions. So first we'll see about the functional anatomy. So where is this hypothalamus? You can see that hypothalamus means it should be below the thalamus, right? So this is the thalamus here, and here we've got the hypothalamus, which is a very small area but has got very important functions, right? So now we'll see the different nuclei of hypothalamus. So this is a rough outline of hypothalamus, and here you've got the optic chiasm, right? So the nuclei that is just above this optic chiasm is the supraoptic nucleus, and then we've got the medial preoptic nucleus and the posterior preoptic nucleus. So supraoptic, preoptic, we've got medial preoptic and posterior preoptic. Then we've got a paraventricular nucleus. So that is one group of nuclei. Now we've got an arcuate nucleus, ventromedial nucleus and dorsomedial nucleus, mammillary body, and then on the posterior part we've got the posterior hypothalamus, and then we've got a lateral hypothalamus which cannot be shown in this picture. So here we've got another cross section, a sagittal section showing the lateral hypothalamus. So these are the different nuclei of hypothalamus, and you should know well about this diagram, right? So now we'll move on to the classification. So we can classify the different regions or zones or groups of nuclei in many based on many different criteria. But the most useful one is as follows. So we've got an anterior group which contains your supraoptic, preoptic and paraventricular nuclei. That is the anterior group of nuclei or anterior hypothalamus. Then we've got the middle group which contains the arcuate, ventromedial, dorsomedial as well as a tuberal. Okay. So middle group contains arcuate, ventromedial, dorsomedial and tuberal nuclei. And then we've got the posterior group which contains your mammillary, supramammillary and posterior hypothalamic nuclei. So mammillary, posterior hypothalamus as well as supramammillary, that is not shown in this diagram, but they include the posterior hypothalamus. And then we've got the lateral group which contains the lateral preoptic and lateral hypothalamic nuclei. So this is the classification based on their location, right? And each of this area has got a specific function. We'll see more about it, right? Outside the blood-brain barrier. Next, we are moving on to a very important area, that is connections of hypothalamus. So why should we learn about these connections? See, we said that hypothalamus is a very small area yet has controls a lot of things in our body. How does it do so? Or how does it know the status of the body, or how does it know when to regulate? That is because it's got many important connections with the other body parts and parts of the brain. So we'll see more about that. So see here. So first we'll see the afferent connections of hypothalamus. What is meant by afferent connections? Which means it is through these connections that the hypothalamus knows what is happening around it. Okay. So from the different areas of the CNS to hypothalamus we have information being passed on. Okay. So we'll see what these afferent connections are. So through the median forebrain bundle we've got information reaching from the midbrain and anterior olfactory area. Now, through the retinohypothalamic fibers, we've got information coming from the retina. Through the palidohypothalamic fibers, we got information from the globus pallidus, which is a part of basal ganglia. And then through the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus, we've got information coming from the periaqueductal gray matter. And through the mammillary peduncle, we've got information coming from the tegmentum of the midbrain. And through the thalamo-hypothalamic fibers, we've got important information coming from the thalamus. So you see that each of these tracts has got an important role to play in the functions of the hypothalamus. For example, these retinohypothalamic fibers play a very important role in case of circadian rhythm. So like that, each of these afferent connections have got a role to play which we'll discuss in the coming slides. Okay. So next we'll see the efferent connections of the hypothalamus. What is meant by efferent connections? Efferent connections are those by which the hypothalamus exerts its effects, or in other words they are output tracks, right? So the hypothalamus again through the medial forebrain bundle influence the hippocampus, right? Then through the mammillothalamic tract gives information to the thalamus. Then through the stria terminalis connects to the limbic system. Through the posterior longitudinal fasciculus connects to the brainstem and the spinal cord. Through the mammato-tegmental tract connects to the tegmentum of the midbrain. Through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract it connects to the pituitary. So these are the important efferent connections of the hypothalamus. So you can see that some of the terms are similar to the afferent connections, like for example medium forebrain bundle, mammato-tegmental tract are similar to the afferent connections, which makes it easier for you to remember, right? So next we'll see the important functions of hypothalamus. So the main important functions of hypothalamus are endocrine functions, autonomic functions, circadian rhythm, role in sleep, temperature regulation, regulation of water intake, regulation of food intake, reproductive functions, influence on emotion, and immunological functions. So we'll see the major ones here, right? So first one is the endocrine functions. So we know that our hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary, right? It is connected through the pituitary via two tracts. So if this is the anterior pituitary, here we've got these portal vessels, right? Remember, hypothalamus produces hormones, regulatory hormones, which reach the pituitary, which in turn stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce another set of hormones. For example, hypothalamus produces thyrotropin releasing hormone, which causes anterior pituitary to produce thyrotropin stimulating hormone, right? So that is how it influences the action of anterior pituitary. What about posterior pituitary? For posterior pituitary, it is a neuroendocrine axis, right? So hypothalamus produces the hormones and stores them in the hearing body, and based on the stimulus, the posterior pituitary will release it. Examples are oxytocin, right? So this is how the hypothalamus controls the endocrine functions of the body. So here again we've got this flowchart showing the similar function of how the different hormones are regulated, right? So hypothalamus, they produce releasing and inhibiting hormones which travel through the portal system and control the anterior pituitary hormone secretion. Then the hypothalamus also secretes two hormones which are antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, which via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract reach the posterior pituitary where they are stored. Okay. Next, moving on to the autonomic functions. So hypothalamus is called the head ganglion of the autonomic system. What is meant by autonomic system? Remember, we've got a sympathetic system as well as a parasympathetic system. Which means if it is called the head ganglion of autonomic system, then hypothalamus also must have a sympathetic leader and a parasympathetic leader, right? So the sympathetic area of the hypothalamus is the lateral hypothalamus as well as the posterior hypothalamus. Remember, your lateral hypothalamus was shown in a different section, and posterior hypothalamus includes your mammillary and the posterior hypothalamus. So what happens if lateral hypothalamus is stimulated? It causes piloerection. Like all the symptoms of a sympathetic stimulation can be seen when lateral hypothalamus is stimulated. It causes piloerection, a rise in BP, an increase in heart rate, sweating, and increased secretion of catecholamines. Whereas posterior hypothalamus stimulation will cause aggression as well as fear or rage. So all these symptoms show that these reflect the stimulation of a sympathetic system, right? So that is how hypothalamus control the autonomic functions. So now we'll see what is the parasympathetic area of the hypothalamus. So parasympathetic area is the anterior hypothalamus, which includes your supraoptic, preoptic nuclei. Remember, we had mentioned a group of nuclei in the anterior part, and they are responsible for the parasympathetic system, and they mainly control via the different vagal responses. Okay, so that is about autonomic function. Next, we'll move on to an important function of hypothalamus, which is circadian rhythm. So you know, circadian rhythm is your 24-hour biological clock, and this hypothalamus will function as this biological clock. Okay, So many tissues, organs and systems of the body show cyclical variation in some of their functional activity, usually at 24-hour periodicity. See, remember, when we say about circadian rhythm, it is not about the sleep-wake cycle. You have to remember that there are many other clocks that are present in the body. See, obviously you've got a sleep-wake cycle, but you've got an appetite cycle also, which regulates your feeding behavior. You've got a temperature cycle. You've got different hormonal cycle. So, therefore we've got circadian genes in all systems of the body, in your cardiovascular system, renal system, in your metabolism. So all this, you've got a lot of biological clocks that is regulated by the hypothalamus. Okay, so that is called the circadian rhythm. Okay, so how does the hypothalamus regulate this? So basically, it is through the retinohypothalamic tract. What is retinohypothalamic tract? So we've got ganglion cells of the retina, right? So from these ganglion cells, we've got these retinohypothalamic fibers which sends information about the external world to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Suprachiasmatic nucleus is the nucleus in the hypothalamus, which in turn will activate genes that code for the clock proteins. So when these retinohypothalamic fibers are stimulated, they produce clock proteins. The suprachiasmatic nucleus will produce clock proteins. Okay. Also, they regulate melatonin secretion from the pineal gland. So there are two mechanisms of action. One, the suprachiasmatic nucleus will activate genes for the clock proteins. Second, they regulate melatonin secretion from the pineal gland. And both of these will help in the regulation of the circadian rhythm. Okay. So from an exam point of view, one important physiological based question that can be asked is, what is jet lag? So jet lag is a temporary sleep disorder that can affect anyone who travels rapidly across multiple time zones. So remember, we know that Earth has got different time zones. So naturally, if you're going through a very far place, your circadian rhythm can be affected. Okay. So a person who is traveling through multiple time zones very rapidly will have this jet lag. They'll have a huge irregularity in their physiological processes. That is because of the disruption in the body's circadian rhythm. And after some time, it will be synchronized to the new time zone, right? So that is about jet lag. Next, we'll see the role in sleep-wake cycle. See, in sleep-wake cycle, the hypothalamus has got a different role other than the circadian rhythm. It is a hypothalamus that regulates when to sleep or how to fall asleep or how to wake. Okay. So here you can see that again the pathway is quite similar. We've got retinohypothalamic fibers that reaches the suprachiasmatic nucleus. But from the suprachiasmatic nucleus, we've got inhibitory fibers going to the dorsal medial hypothalamus. And from there, we've got information passing on to two different areas. See, this is the lateral hypothalamic area which promotes wakefulness, and this is the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus which stimulates sleep. Okay, so if the retinohypothalamic fibers are stimulated, like for example, if it is a daytime, what happens? It will inhibit this dorsomedial hypothalamic area, so that this pathway, see, dorsomedial hypothalamic area was inhibiting this wake promoting area. So what does retinohypothalamic do? They will inhibit this so that the wakefulness can be stimulated. So don't worry, I've got a flow chart coming up which will clearly explain the role of each. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus projects through the paraventricular area, projects to the dorsomedial hypothalamus, right? Dorsomedial hypothalamus. This dorsal medial hypothalamus has the control over two different areas, which is the lateral hypothalamic area, which promotes wakefulness, and ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, which is the sleep promoting neurons. So suppose the retinohypothalamic tract is active, that is, if it is a daytime, what happens? The suprachiasmatic nucleus will inhibit the dorsal medial hypothalamus, so that the lateral hypothalamic area will be stimulated and ventrolateral preoptic nucleus will be inhibited. Okay, so there will be wakefulness and turning off of sleep promoting neurons. So that is how hypothalamus regulates the sleep wake cycle, right? is a very simplified version of our sleep wake cycle. There are many other complex things going on, but at least you should note these two centers, that lateral hypothalamic area is responsible for wakefulness and ventrolateral preoptic nucleus is responsible for sleep. Okay. So next we'll see about the role of hypothalamus in temperature regulation. So the main area that controls the temperature in hypothalamus is the anterior hypothalamic preoptic area. So they contain heat sensitive neurons as well as cold sensitive neurons. So suppose the external atmosphere is really hot, or if your body temperature increases, what happens? The heat sensitive neurons will be stimulated, and once they are stimulated, they produce profuse sweating, vasodilation of the blood vessels, as well as decrease in heat production. So these mechanisms will help to bring down the body temperature to normal, right? When you sweat profusely, when there is vasodilation, when there is decreased heat production, it will reduce the body temperature back to normal. But suppose if it is very cold, okay, what happens if your body temperature is less? The cold sensitive neurons will be stimulated, and this in turn will cause inhibition of sweating, promote skin vasoconstriction as well as thermogenesis. So that is the role of anterior hypothalamus in temperature regulation. Now posterior hypothalamus too have got a small role, because not a small role, it integrates the central and peripheral temperature sensory signals. See, remember we've got a core temperature as well as a skin temperature. So the posterior hypothalamus integrates the central and peripheral temperature signals, and it contains a primary motor center for shivering. See, when it is very cold, we tend to shiver, right? That area is controlled by the posterior hypothalamus. So remember, in temperature regulation, both the anterior as well as the posterior hypothalamus has got an important role. Next, we'll see about the regulation of food intake. What is the role of hypothalamus in food intake? Again, you've got a hunger center which is located in the lateral hypothalamic area, as well as a satiety center which is located in the ventromedial nucleus. So here the mechanism is the feeding center is tonically active. Every time your body wants to feed, but it is transiently inhibited by the satiety center after food intake. Once you eat food, the satiety center will inhibit the feeding center. Okay. So other important areas that are important in regulation of food intake is arcuate nucleus as well as mammillary bodies, which are important for overall control of gastrointestinal activity. So here we've got to, go in detail a bit. So next we'll see about a very important function of hypothalamus, that is regulation of water intake. So we know that the two major factors that affect water intake are plasma osmolarity and extracellular fluid volume. Okay, so what are the two important factors? Osmolarity as well as ECF volume. So hypothalamus responds to changes in both these factors, osmolarity as well as ECF volume. And hypothalamus is a major thirst center in the brain. Remember, we had talked about the different centers outside the blood-brain barrier, right? Remember what OVLT is? Organovasculosum of lamina terminalis. And what is SFO? Subpharyngeal organ. So we'll see how the hypothalamus regulates the water intake. So suppose the osmolarity of the blood increases. So suppose there's a lot of sweating, your osmolarity increases. Okay. What happens? That will be detected by the osmoreceptors that are present in the hypothalamus. Okay. This in turn will cause stimulation of the thirst center, so that the person will try to drink water. It increases the water intake. Similarly, suppose there is a decrease in the ECA volume. Suppose the person has diarrhea. A lot of fluid has been lost from his body. Again, the hypothalamic neurons will be stimulated. In this case, the left atrial volume receptors will be stimulated. That means your blood volume has decreased. So the left atrial volume receptors will be stimulated, and this in turn will cause an increased vasopressin secretion. It will stimulate the release of antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin. So what happens? There will be increased ADH secretion, right? So there will be increased water reabsorption, so that the plasma volume can come back to normal. Another important effect of this is it will stimulate the secretion of renin. renin is a hormone that is stimulated by that is produced by the juxtaglomerular cells of the JGA apparatus. So when renin is stimulated, what happens? The RAS network will be stimulated, right? Renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, which causes release of angiotensin 2. Okay, which again is a potent vasoconstrictor and will bring back, will stimulate aldosterone and increase water reabsorption. So these are the two important mechanisms that are involved in regulation of water intake. So to summarize, we talked about the different functions of the hypothalamus after knowing about its functional anatomy and nuclei. We talked about the endocrine functions and we learned how it is connected to the pituitary. And then we talked about the different autonomic functions and we talked about the sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic area and what are its effects. And then we talked about the circadian rhythm and what is the role of suprachiasmatic nucleus and the retinohypothalamic fibers and all in the circadian rhythm. Then we talked about the role of sleep, a sleep wake cycle, or the role of hypothalamus, and there we talked about the sleep promoting as well as the wakefulness promoting areas of the hypothalamus. And then we talked about the temperature regulation, where we talked about the heat sensitive neurons and the cold sensitive neurons and what are their effects. Then we talked about the regulation of food intake, the flowchart of which is available in a separate video which I've taken exclusively for regulation of food intake, because it is a bit more it's got a bit more information, so that is why I did not include in this particular segment. And we've got the regulation of water intake, wherein we talked about what happens when the osmolarity and ECF volume changes and what are the effects on hypothalamus. So that would conclude our major functions of hypothalamus. So I hope this concept is clear. Thank you.